Hello there everybody, Martin here from Affinity for Commander. Today I'm going to be giving you my suggestions on how you can improve your fancy new Explorers of the Deep Merfolk deck for only €22 at that. That's around £19 for all our British viewers and about $24 for our North American followers. But before we begin, if you plan on purchasing any of the cards you see in this video, or any other card game accessories for that matter, then please use our affiliate links in the video description. It won't cost you anything extra to make your purchases through these, but it really helps out the channel a lot. So with that out of the way, let's move on to the video. First of all, let's take a look at what legend we want to lead the deck for us. Included in the deck we have a staggering 9 green and blue legendary creatures, including 3 new ones from this set. However, even with all of these options, I'm going to be sticking to the face commander of this deck, Hakbal the Surging Soul. For 2 generic, a green and a blue, we get a 3/3 Merfolk Scout with the following abilities. At the beginning of combat on your turn, each Merfolk creature you control explores. And whenever Hakbal of the Surging Soul attacks, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. If you don't, draw a card. So let's break it down to see what we actually get here. Exploring each combat for each of your Merfolk has 3 potential outcomes. Firstly, it could help you to draw all of those lands that are sitting on top of your library, meaning that you're less likely to miss a land drop and less likely to have dead draws in the late game. Secondly, you could get a heads up as to what useful card you're about to draw next, and put a +1/+1 counter on your creatures to boot. Or thirdly, you could filter through the less than useful cards on top of your library, putting them into your graveyard and giving you a better chance of drawing something more appropriate to the situation at hand. Similarly to the second outcome, this scenario also lets you put a +1/+1 counter on at least one of your creatures, and may also let you draw more land in the process. And it's this flexibility and clear theme of Merfolk and +1/+1 counters that leads me to put Hakbal as the commander for this deck. So, now we know who's leading the deck, let's take a look at what cards we're going to take out to make room for some new additions. First up, we have Benthic Biomancer, a 1/1 for 1 that lets you loot each time you put a counter on them. Whilst this isn't a terrible ability, there are plenty of cards in our deck that let us draw cards without a downside of discarding them, so this card gets the chop. Next up on the chopping block we have Coralheim Commander, a 2/2 for 2 who can eventually gain flying and give all of your other Merfolk +1/+1. My issue with this guy is that there are plenty of other 2 or 3 mana Merfolk that buff your creatures, and this guy takes a whopping 6 mana investment to get to that stage. He just isn't good enough. Next we have Merfolk Skydiver, a 1/1 for 2 mana who puts a +1/+1 counter on something when he enters the battlefield and can proliferate for 5 mana. Now, this card isn't terrible, and I actually really like the proliferate ability as a way to sink excess mana in the late game. However, there are plenty of other cards in the deck that increase the number of +1/+1 counters on our units much more efficiently than this guy, and we just don't have room for inefficient spells in the deck. Our next removal from this deck is Evolution Sage, quite a controversial one, but hear me out. Now for one, this creature isn't a Merfolk, and so won't benefit from any of our buffs or synergies that care about creature type. And whilst proliferating as a landfall ability is very synergistic for our +1/+1 counters theme, I just don't think our deck needs this level of support to function efficiently. Our next cuts are Merfolk Cave Dweller and Sage of Fables, 2 Merfolk that are simply being cut to make room for better Merfolk in the deck. And by that same logic, I will also be cutting Prime Speaker Zagana and Tashana Voice of Thunder. For me, these 2 fall into the category of big smashy creatures, which honestly our aggro deck does not need. They also cost 6 and 7 mana respectively, which is something I'm not willing to invest in for the power that they put out. And that leads us to our final creature cut. This guy. The Smiling Flood, don't make me say his name. This adorable axolotl has a very powerful ability, of that there is no doubt. However, I have taken him out of the deck for a few select reasons. Firstly, they aren't a Merfolk and do not help with the type theme of the deck at all. Next, similarly to the previous 2 cards, they cost 6 mana, which is an awful lot of investment when we want to be low to the ground, hitting fast and hitting hard. And finally, I don't think I would ever emotionally recover if anything happened to that adorable little critter. I mean, look at that chubby little face. So that's all of the creatures we're going to be cutting. Let's take a look at the non-creature spells. Curse of the Swine is a really fun card to cast, and it gets around creatures of Indestructible by exiling all of its targets. However, this deck is already packed full of removal spells, and some of them just have to go. Up next we have Explore and Growth Spiral. Both of these are fantastic ramp spells, however we have just cut the biggest 3 spells in our deck, so there's just no need for them. Our next cut is Quandrix Command, which we are going to be getting rid of and replacing with a better counterspell. And in this same vein of thinking, we're getting rid of Ruinous Intrusion and Commit to Memory. Neither of these are bad spells per se, but I think we can do better. And finally, we're going to be saying bye to 5 non-basic lands in the form of Llanowar Reborn, Mosswort Bridge, Simic Grove Chamber, Temple of Mystery, and Vine Glimmer Snarl. All 5 of these lands enter tapped, except for the Vine Glimmer Snarl, which may not enter tapped provided you have the right card in hand, but these just frankly aren't good enough for the deck. And both Llanowar Reborn and Mosswort Bridge only tap for 1 colour, and that's the least used colour in the deck. They have to go. So we have taken out the 20 least appealing cards in this deck. Let's take a look at what we replace them with. First off, we have our only 1 mana creature, Mistcaller. This little guy is super versatile and will often go unnoticed and dismissed as just a 1/1 with no relevant abilities. However, Mistcaller can completely shut down infinite combos that rely on flickering creatures or returning creatures from the graveyard, such as those involving Felidar Guardian or Revelark. And with this interaction being from an activated ability rather than a spell being cast, it'll make it that much harder for your opponents to stop with their counterspells. Up next we have Lord of Atlantis and Voldalian Hexcatcher. Merfolk have a ridiculous amount of lords at their disposal, so it only seemed right to put the missing 2 from the Precon deck in there now. Lord of Atlantis also has the great ability of giving your Merfolk Island Walk, whereas the Hexcatcher can help you to counter your opponent's spells by sacrificing your Merfolk. And if that wasn't enough, the Hexcatcher also has Flash, so you can wait for your opponents to block, flash them in, pump your board, and cause utter chaos. I love it. And speaking of flashy creatures, our next includes our Merfolk Trickster and Swift Warden. Removing a creature's ability at instant speed is one of the best ways of messing up your opponent's game plan. I guarantee you that nothing feels better than removing Nekasar's ability with a wheel spell on the stack and tapping the Nekasar, leaving them vulnerable to attacks at the same time. Amazing. As for Swift Warden, being able to protect your commander or lords from spot removal at instant speed can be a game changer, especially with a go-wide deck such as this. Up next we have 2 Merfolk that let us tutor our decks, Merrow Harbinger and Forerunner of the Heralds. Both of these Merfolk allow you to search your library for a fishy friend and put it on top of your deck, which in some circumstances can be better than putting them into your hand. So let's say you've just cast the Harbinger and use their ability to put Voldalian Hexcatcher on top of your library. You then move to combat and each of your Merfolk explore, with you guaranteeing putting a +1/+1 counter on each of them, knowing there's a creature on top of your library. Next you declare your attackers and use Hackbal's ability to put the Hexcatcher into your hand rather than putting a land into play. Flash that bad boy in and you've just given your entire board +2/+2 and added 2 bodies to it for only 5 mana. What a bargain. Next on our list we have our only non-Merfolk creature inclusion, and that is Sea Hunter. This mercenary may be an enemy of the Merfolk lore-wise, but he is a valuable ally in terms of gameplay. For 3 mana you can tutor your library for any Merfolk your heart desires and put them into play, even at instant speed. Yes, this fine gentleman can search whatever card you need for the given situation. Need more power to bust through those blockers? Poof! Here's a Lord. Need some more protection for your creatures? Boom! Now they all have Ward too. As a side note, Sea Hunter searches out Merfolk permanent cards, not just creatures, so feel free to search up those tribal enchantments as well. Speaking of which, our next inclusion is Merfolk Commerce, a 2 mana enchantment that untaps each of your Merfolk at the beginning of your end step. Never again will you have to worry about keeping up blockers and not swinging with everything, as this card will give your creatures pseudo-vigilance. And with this card being an enchantment, it is that much harder for your opponents to remove than the Smiling Axolotl will be removed to make space for it. Up next we have our +1/+1 counter support package in the form of Court of Garenbrig and Ozolith the Shattered Spire. Popping an extra +1/+1 counter on 2 of your creatures in your upkeep is pretty powerful, but being able to double the number of +1/+1 counters on your creatures, now that is something else. And should you lose the monarchy, retaking it shouldn't be that difficult given that a lot of our creatures have evasion such as Island Walk. And if all else fails, you're most likely going to have a big enough board state to be able to swing in and take it back by force. As for Ozolith the Shattered Spire, a second hardened scale effect is never something to sniff at, but being able to put 2 +1/+1 counters on one of your creatures for 2 mana is pretty decent as well. Taking a look at the deck's instants and sorceries, it's clear to see that we have a lot of removal, which is pretty unusual for a Simic deck. However, we are looking rather low on counterspells, which I'm pretty sure is illegal for a deck that's predominantly blue. So our next additions are Counterspell and Cancel, 2 classic spells that just say no. Up next we have Stubborn Denial, a 1 mana counterspell that will almost always get their Ferocious ability to trigger, given that our commander just needs to trigger their ability once to give themselves 4 power. And if there's one thing we like more than counterspells, it's cheap counterspells. And our final non-land addition to the deck is for the Ancestors, a card that reminds me a bit of a watered down version of Collected Company. However, I've chosen to include this card over the Company for one very good reason. It has Flashback. Whilst putting 2 creatures from your library into play at instant speed is very powerful, the possibility of putting up to 12 Merfolk into your hand is just so much better for this style of deck. And let's be honest, our curve is so low to the ground that you'll probably be able to cast this spell and then also cast 1 or 2 of the Merfolk you get from it in the same turn, provided you're far enough along in the game. Now onto the lands, and oh boy did this section need some upgrades. So one of the main issues I had with this Precon's mana base was that a lot of the lands came in tapped. As a result, these 5 new additions will all come in untapped. First off we have Flooded Grove and Yavimaya Coast, both of which can tap for either green or blue provided certain costs are paid. However, I'm sure you'll agree that paying 1 life or having access to 1 other green or blue mana are very small prices to pay in order to achieve this. And in the very rare cases that you can't pay these costs, both of these lands still tap for colourless mana, meaning that they are still useful to you. Up next we have Bark Channel Pathway and Dreamroot Cascade. Whilst the pathway only taps for 1 colour of mana throughout the game, you do get to pick which one this is, making it infinitely more useful than just playing a basic. And yes, I know that the Cascade can potentially come untapped, but playing it after turn 3 fixes that issue, so hopefully you've got a couple more lands you can play before it. And finally, we have a spicy utility land in the form of Ghost Quarter. Whilst land destruction is often frowned upon in the Commander community, I guarantee you no one will complain when you blow up a Field of the Dead or Cabal Coffers. Well, maybe one player, but you did just blow up their land. And in a worst case scenario, you can blow up one of your own land in order to find the basic that you need. Never underestimate the power of versatility. And there you have it, 1 Explorers of the Deep budget upgrade guide. I do hope that you enjoyed it. Do you agree with the changes I've made? Are there any cards I took out that you would have kept in? Let me know in the comments below. I'd like to give a huge thank you to each and every one of our incredible patrons, including our newest patron, Magic Mackie J. Thank you all so much for your support, without which we would not be able to continue making videos such as this. And don't forget that you can help to support the channel in 4 quick and easy ways: liking this video, subscribing, hitting the bell icon, and leaving us a comment. I read them all. Well, that is it for now. I've been Martin, and I will see you next time. Stay awesome!